You ever notice how excited you get at the beginning of something and how strangely empty it feels a few weeks later? The gym is a perfect example. Day 1, new shoes, new playlist, main character energy. Day 14, same treadmill, same wall, same sweat. And suddenly your brain is like, this is it? This is my life now? Or maybe it's journaling, or studying, or waking up early, or trying to change anything really. At first it feels meaningful, then it feels repetitive. Then, if you're honest, it feels boring, and that's usually where you stop. Not because it's hard, not because you can't do it, but because it no longer gives you that little emotional hit of novelty. If that sounds familiar, yeah, this might be you, or someone you know, or all of us at different moments. What almost no one talks about is this quiet paradox. The habits that change your life the most are often the least exciting to perform. And there's a deep psychological reason why consistency feels boring, and why the people who quietly change everything learn to make peace with that boredom. Let's talk about that. Because once you see what's actually happening in your mind, the boredom stops being a problem and starts becoming a signal. Let's start with a familiar character. You know the type. Maybe you are the type. This is the person who loves starting things. They get a rush from fresh notebooks, new routines, new plans. They're energized by possibility, by potential, by the feeling of becoming someone new. The first few days feel electric. The brain is flooded with dopamine, not because the habit is working yet, but because it's new. New equals interesting. New equals rewarding. But then the novelty wears off. The habit starts to feel flat. No emotional fireworks. No visible progress. No instant feedback. And that's when the mind quietly whispers, this isn't working. Or worse, this isn't you. What's really happening is simple but sneaky. Your brain is wired to chase change, not repetition. Dopamine spikes when there's unpredictability, when something feels fresh or surprising. Consistency, by definition, removes surprise. So when you repeat the same action day after day, your brain stops celebrating it. Not because it's useless, but because it's stable. And stability doesn't feel exciting. It feels invisible. This type often confuses boredom with failure. They think motivation is supposed to feel like energy, when in reality, long-term change feels more like quiet commitment. If you've ever abandoned a habit not because it was difficult but because it felt dull, you might recognize yourself here. Then there's another profile. This one looks disciplined from the outside, but inside, they're constantly negotiating. They show up inconsistently, consistently. They do the habit, but only when it feels right, when the mood is good, when the day is calm, when the motivation shows up on time. On productive days, they're all in. On heavy days, the habit disappears. Psychologically, this is emotional dependency. The behavior is tied to how they feel, not to who they are. The problem is that emotions are terrible managers. They're inconsistent, reactive, and easily distracted. Consistency, by contrast, requires you to act without emotional reward, to do the thing even when it doesn't feel meaningful. And that's where boredom enters again. Boredom is the emotion you feel when there's no novelty and no emotional payoff. But here's the twist. Boredom isn't telling you to stop. It's telling you that the habit has moved from exciting to structural, from something you do because it feels good to something you do because it's part of your life. That transition feels uncomfortable because it threatens the ego. You're no longer inspired, you're just consistent. And for many people, that feels dangerously close to being ordinary. Which brings us to another type. This one quietly resists consistency. Not because it's boring, but because it's humbling. They love intensity, big efforts, big pushes, big transformations. What they don't love is the small, unglamorous repetition. Consistency strips away the drama. There's no heroic struggle in brushing your teeth answering emails, or doing 30 minutes of focused work every day. No story to tell, no visible proof of effort, just repetition. And psychologically, this can feel threatening because intensity feels like identity. Consistency feels like process. When you rely on intensity, you get to feel special. When you rely on consistency, you have to accept that change is slow, quiet, and mostly invisible. This is why consistency feels boring. It doesn't feed the ego. It doesn't say, "Look how hard you're trying." It says, "Just keep going." And that's not very romantic. But here's where things get interesting, because there's another group of people, often unnoticed, rarely loud, who experience consistency differently. These are the people who don't wait to feel motivated. They don't interpret boredom as a warning sign. They've learned something subtle. Boredom is a threshold. Once a habit feels boring, it means it's no longer draining mental energy. It means the behavior is becoming automatic. In psychology, this is where habits start to compound. When an action requires less decision-making, less emotional energy, less internal debate, the brain stops resisting. The behavior slips into the background. And that's where real change happens. Not in the exciting phase, not in the emotional phase, but in the boring, repetitive middle. Consistency works because it bypasses motivation entirely. It doesn't rely on how you feel today. It relies on what you do, repeatedly, over time. The reason consistency changes everything is precisely because it doesn't feel like much in the moment. If it felt dramatic, you'd burn out. If it felt exciting forever, you'd depend on that excitement. Instead, it feels neutral, and neutrality is powerful because it allows progress without self-obsession. Finally, there's a quieter type, the one most people don't notice until years later. This person doesn't talk much about what they're doing. Their habits look almost unimpressive. Same walk every day, same reading time, same effort repeated quietly. They've made peace with boredom, not by forcing themselves to enjoy it, but by reinterpreting it. To them, boredom is proof of alignment. It means there's no inner resistance, no drama, no negotiation, just action. And over time, something strange happens. While others restart, rebrand, and reinvent themselves every few months, this person accumulates results, not because they worked harder, but because they stayed longer. Consistency doesn't feel like progress. It creates progress. That's the psychological trick. So if you've been waiting for consistency to feel inspiring, motivating, or emotionally rewarding, you might be waiting for the wrong signal. The boredom you feel isn't a flaw. It's evidence that the habit is settling into place. The question isn't, how do I make this more exciting? It's, can I keep going even when it isn't? So which type did you recognize? The starter, the negotiator, the intensity chaser, or the quiet builder? Maybe you've been all of them at different times, and maybe the next shift isn't about finding a new method, habit, or motivation trick, but about staying put when your mind says, this is dull now. Because on the other side of boredom isn't failure, it's momentum. If this landed somewhere for you, take a moment and notice it. And if you want more reflections like this, about the quiet patterns that shape how we live, you know where to find them.